So the camera's on you, alright.
Yep. Hi everybody, today I'm going to be talking about the criminal justice system and the use of solitary confinement in prisons. On March 19th, 2013, Tom Clemens, Executive Director of Colorado State Prisons, was shot and killed by 28-year-old Evan Ebel, a white supremacist that had just been released from solitary confinement in a Colorado State prison. Prior to the shooting, Ebel also murdered a pizza delivery man so that he could use his shirt and pizza box as props to stage a delivery to the Clemens home. After the murders, Ebel fled to Texas, where the officer that pulled him over was shot in the head and suffered significant brain damage. Psychology and mental health have always been very interesting to me. I've done studies and research in psychology and sociology that are similar to this topic. The criminal justice system and ensuring its proper functioning are very important to the society that we are all a part of. Many people think that issues like solitary confinement don't really matter and it won't have any effect on them. Well, they couldn't be more wrong. Let's imagine being confined in a little box 6 feet by 8 feet, approximately the size of a standard parking space, for 23 hours a day with nothing to do, no windows to look out, and no contact with the outside world. What effect do you think this would have on your mental health? Solitary confinement has been proven over and over again to cause psychological damage to prisoners, which can lead them to cause harm to themselves and other people, which is contrary to the purpose of the criminal justice system. Let's begin by learning some of the history and the facts of solitary confinement in the criminal justice system. On average, there are about 2.26 million people in prisons. The U.S. has one of the world's highest incarceration ratings, with about 1% of the adult population in prisons. Studies done in 2000 and 2005 show that there were 80,000 people in solitary confinement, according to Casella and Ridgway 2012. This number is considered low since there are about 44,000 people in 8 federal prisons alone. Solitary confinement, segregation, and restrictive housing units are all terms used for the separation of a prisoner from the general prison population. The Quakers were the ones to first introduce the idea of segregation as a form of rehabilitating criminals without resorting to violence in the late 18th century. In 1787, Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia began to hand out segregation sentences. It was thought that the time alone and the separation from the other prisoners would allow the inmate to find himself and develop a relationship with God. This, however, was not what happened. The experiment resulted in prisoners suffering psychological damage, becoming violently insane, depressed, and committing suicide. After a litigation in 1890, the use of segregation as a corrective measure was largely abandoned. However, it was reintroduced in 1983 after 2 guards were murdered at Illinois' Marion State Prison, which was considered to be one of the highest security prisons in the country at the time. The murders induced a 23-year lockdown where prisoners were kept in their cells for 23 hours a day and visitors were prohibited. In August 1971, psychology professor Dr. Philip Zimbardo decided to do an experiment to see if violence in prisons was a result of the bad people that were put there, or maybe it could be contributed to something else, such as the prison setting itself. He put an ad in the paper for volunteers for a research project that was supposed to last for 2 weeks. 70 people responded to the ad, and the healthiest 24 of them were split into equal groups of guards and prisoners. The experiment turned into a disaster. The prisoners and the guards became hostile towards one another. The guards used their power to humiliate the prisoners, and the prisoners resisted and insulted the guards. The experiment was halted before a week was up to prevent irreparable psychological damage to the subjects. Now that we know some of the history of solitary confinement, we can see why segregation is such a hot topic in the criminal justice system today and even in politics. We know that people end up in prison because they broke the law, but what are the conditions for admittance into solitary confinement? An inmate can be put into segregation if he is deemed a threat to himself, the guards, or other inmates. He can also be put into modified behavior as a punishment for not complying to the rules, if they're suspected to be involved in gangs, or if they possess contraband, and sometimes just to fill up empty space. It costs about $75,000 a year to have a prisoner in solitary confinement versus $25,000 a year for a prisoner who is not in solitary confinement. The effects of solitary confinement are categorized into groups called Special Housing Unit Syndrome or SHU syndrome. These symptoms can include hallucinations, hypersensitivity, insomnia, paranoia, rage, fear, depression, and increased risk of suicide. Metzner and Fellner, 2010. In many cases, it's not the most violent prisoners that end up in SHU, it's the most vulnerable. In 2006, 21-year-old Timothy Souders went to prison for shoplifting. He suffered from bipolar disorder and depression. He was put into solitary confinement on August 2nd for taking a shower without permission. After breaking a stool and flooding his cell, he was placed in punitive restraints in his cell for up to 18 hours at a time. 4 days later, 2 hours after the restraints came off, Souders died of dehydration. Pelley, 2007. We can see that solitary confinement harms not only the prisoners, but can also cause harm to the lives of prison staff and public if the prisoner is released directly from segregation back into the population. What can be done to try to reform the prison system and reduce the risk of recidivism? Prisons should revise the conditions for admittance into solitary confinement to ensure that those being admitted do not suffer from severe psychiatric conditions. They should also set rules for the conditions of release from solitary confinement. Prisons need to have psychiatric care available to prisoners and develop programs to help inmates work through their problems. Dr. Joel Votskin from the University of Arizona says this: overly punitive approaches used on violent, angry criminals only provide a breeding ground for more anger and more violence. The U.S. has experimented with solitary confinement before and realized that it was not producing the desired results. So why do we keep going back to something that doesn't work? I think we can all agree it's important to make sure those within the prison system are well taken care of. Not all, but many inmates will be returned to society, and as we've seen in the beginning of the presentation with the story of Tom Clemens, solitary confinement can definitely have an effect on a person's mental health. The prison system needs to do its part without making matters worse by returning inmates to society with considerably more psychological damage than when they went in. Solitary confinement isn't the antidote, it's the disease.